Hey guys, welcome back. This is the second video that you'll be watching for your first unit, Foundations and Formations of Government. Our essential questions today are how do different types and systems of government operate, and how can characteristics of American democracy be seen throughout history? So to get started, there are three main systems of government, and then there are three types of government. The systems, though, we'll start with a unitary system, and remember you should be taking notes on this on that Google Doc that I sent out to you. A unitary system is one in which a strong central government pretty much controls everything. In a unitary system, if there are any like smaller regional governments, they don't have a whole lot of power. So you can remember that by the prefix of unitary, U-N-I, that prefix means one. So whenever you hear of a unitary system, think of a government or a country that has one strong central government. Next we have a confederal system. And in a confederal system, we have pretty much just the opposite of a unitary system. In a confederal system or a confederacy, there is no strong central government. Okay, so we have what's called a loose union of independent states. Now, to give you an example of that, if you can think back to America under the Articles of Confederation, which we'll talk about here in a couple of weeks, we had a really loose union of independent states. The states could pretty much do whatever they wanted to. The federal government didn't really have much power. Moving on then to the federal system, this is what we have in the United States today. A federal system is one in which power is shared between a national government and many state governments. And I emphasize the importance of a federal system because this is something that is most likely going to be on your EOC. So please make sure that you understand the concept of a federal system. Federal system, federal government, and federalism are terms that are all used interchangeably. So when we're talking about a federal system, we're saying a type of government or a system of government in which power is shared between a national government and regional governments. So we have a federal system because we have one national government in Washington, D.C., and then we have regional governments. We have state governments, we have city governments, we have county governments, and so on and so forth. So we have a federal system. Just to backtrack, to make sure that you've got it all, a unitary system, one central government with pretty much all the power. A confederal system is a loose union of independent states. The states basically have all the power. And a federal system is a division of power between the national government and many states. So pause me for a minute, make sure you've got all that stuff down, and then move on. All right, moving on to types of government. There are three main types of government, but then there's a whole bunch of different subtypes of those types, and I'll do my best to explain it. First of all, we've got a democracy. Now, democracy should be near and dear to all of your hearts because we have a pure democracy in the United States, right? Wrong. We do not have a pure democracy. We actually have what's called a republic. But before I get ahead of myself, a democracy is government by a large group of people. You should know that. Government by a large group of people. So there are two types of democracies. One of them is a direct democracy. And in a direct democracy, all of the eligible citizens in a country or a city participate directly. So to give you an example, ancient Athens was the first civilization that came up with a direct democracy. All of the male Athenian citizens gathered together to make decisions on issues that affected everybody. So that's a direct democracy. The other type of democracy is a representative democracy. It's also called a republic, and it's also called an indirect democracy. On your EOC, it's probably going to be described as a representative or republic, representative democracy or a republic. So to give you some info on the representative democracy, people elect delegates to make government decisions on their behalf. People elect delegates to make government decisions on their behalf. Now, we have a representative democracy or a republic, like I said earlier, in our country today because we elect members of Congress, we elect the president at the national level, and then the state level, we have our governor and our state legislators to make those government decisions on our behalf. Now, a way that you can kind of remember the difference between a direct and a representative democracy. A direct democracy, people participate directly. It works best in small areas. A representative democracy, people elect representatives to represent them. okay? We'll talk about that more in class. Next, you've got an oligarchy, and an oligarchy is a government by a small group of people. And most of the time, in an oligarchy, the people in charge have probably taken over by force, or maybe they're like the upper crust, the wealthy people in a society that because of their wealth and influence are able to control the government. And then you've got an autocracy. Now, there are a bunch of different types of autocracies. We're going to focus primarily on two. Now, autocracy, in general, an autocracy is ruled by one person, okay? So, there are a couple different types of autocracies. Make sure you're getting this stuff down. Please remember you can pause me if you need to. The first type that we want to look at is a totalitarian dictatorship. Now, you guys have heard of dictators before. They typically are not nice people. They're not really great rulers. They don't care much for the well-being of the citizens. So a totalitarian dictator, it is a type of autocracy. Most of the time, these dictators take power by force, military force. An example, if you need something to connect this with, would be like Castro in Cuba, or Hitler would be another great example of a dictator, even though he didn't really take power by force. But anyway, that's the persona of a dictator that I want you to think of. The other type of autocracies are monarchies. Now, there are two types of monarchies, and I know I'm giving you a lot of stuff here, but remember, pause me if you need to. The first type of monarchy is a constitutional monarchy. And this is a type of government in which you've got a head of state, which would be like a king or a queen, and then you've got a legislative body. Like Congress in America is our legislative body. But for example, in Great Britain, you have Parliament, which is their legislative body. So in a constitutional monarchy, you have a ruler, like a king or a queen, ruling jointly with a legislative body. Now, most of the time, that ruler has limited authority. Okay, so when you think of a constitutional monarchy, you want to think of a government in which a king or a queen is limited in power. And like I said earlier, an example of a constitutional monarchy would be Great Britain. So moving on then to the other type of monarchy, which would be an absolute monarchy. Now, this is probably something that you referenced in world history last year, but an absolute monarch is one that has all power. Okay, Louis XIV in France would be a prime example of an absolute monarch, someone who has all the power, makes decisions that affect everyone. The only difference between an absolute monarch and a dictator is pretty much the way that they typically treat the citizens. We don't normally associate a king with not really caring about their citizens. We really associate a dictator with that description. So, pause me if you need to here, go back, make sure you have the three types of government, the three systems of government, and then move on. All right, now we want to move on to constitutions. Now, we are going to talk a great deal about the United States Constitution and the Missouri Constitution, but here we just want to talk about what a constitution is in general. A constitution is, here on number 1, here's what I want you to know for that. A constitution is a framework for government. Simple as that, a framework for government. Sometimes constitutions can be written. Sometimes constitutions can be just a whole bunch of laws, a whole bunch of precedents that have been established. In our situation, our constitution is obviously written down. Great Britain's constitution, though, is not. It's made up of a whole bunch of different documents, a whole bunch of different precedents and guidelines. So now moving on to a constitutional government versus government with a constitution. Now this kind of seems like the same thing, but it's really not. A constitutional government is one in which the rulers are restricted. They don't have all power, and they are restricted by the Constitution. So the Constitution says that the leader can do this, but he can't do that. The leader can encourage you to speak freely. The leader cannot restrict your freedom of speech. He is bound by that Constitution. Okay, and then a government with a constitution, this other one, this is a situation in which the Constitution just sets up the framework for government. So maybe the Constitution says we're going to have a king, we're going to have a parliament, but it doesn't really set any limits or boundaries on what those rulers can do. So which of these do you think we have? A constitutional government or a government with a constitution? Take a second, think about that, and I'll answer it at the end of the video. All right, moving on then to democracy. Now, I told you earlier that we don't have a pure democracy, but like we discussed a slide or two ago, we do have a type of a democracy. We have a representative democracy, which is also a republic, okay? We talked about those two types of democracy up a couple slides ago. So just to review that with you, the two types of democracy are direct democracies and representative democracies. Remember, representative democracy, indirect democracy, and republic are all interchangeable terms, okay? Now, in order for democracy to take place, or to take hold in a new place, you have to have 5 things, basically. The first thing you have to have is active citizen participation. So the people in your country have to be willing to get involved, have to be willing to do stuff in their government. So you have to have people who are willing to run for president and vice president and who are willing to run for other political and governmental offices. You have to have people who are willing to go out and vote to help make decisions. Otherwise, democracy isn't going to work. You also have to have a favorable economy. Now this one, this prerequisite is sometimes confusing because people think, well, our economy isn't really great right now in America, so do we still have a democracy? Yes. The favorable economy part, it basically, if you have a situation in which there's like a large gap between the rich and the poor, or there's a whole lot of really rich people in a country, and then there's everybody else. Or if there's a whole bunch of poor people and not a lot of rich people, if there's really no middle class, a democracy really isn't going to take hold. And we'll talk about that in a couple sections when we look at types of economies. You also have to have widespread education or an educated public. People have to be able to get information in order to make informed decisions for a democracy to work. You have to have a civil society, which is a lot of organizations that exist independently of the government. And then you also have to have a social consensus. And that word consensus was in your last video, and it means that the majority of people agree. Okay, so the majority of people in a country have to agree that a democracy is a good idea, because if they don't, then you're going to have an uprising or rebellion or whatever, and your democracy is not going to work. So now moving on to characteristics of American democracy, some things that make American democracy special. First of all, we have individual liberty. That means that you have the freedom to do what you want, for the most part. You also have free elections. Now, that typically it doesn't have to mean it doesn't cost anything to go vote. A free election is meaning that it's a principle called one person, one vote. So my vote doesn't count any more than your vote. The president's vote doesn't count any more than my vote. We're all equal. Everybody gets one vote. It all counts the same. And then you also have to have, or we also have, majority rule with minority rights. So to give you an example, in the 2012 presidential election, the majority of people in the United States voted for President Obama. The minority of people in the United States voted for Mitt Romney or another third-party candidate. So what did we do with the people who voted for Mitt Romney? What did we do with the people who voted for a third-party candidate whose candidate didn't win? Nothing. We respected their rights, even though they weren't part of the majority. And that's pretty much what majority rule with minority rights is. It's the concept of the majority opinion will win or will prevail, but the rights of the minority are still respected. And that takes me then to Endo v. United States. It's a landmark Supreme Court case that we're going to work on in class, and it deals specifically with that issue of majority rule with minority rights. So that's all we've got for today. And to answer the question that I posed earlier, do we have a constitutional government or a government with a constitution? The answer is a constitutional government, because the Constitution actually limits what our government officials can do. So that is all for today. Make sure that you have completed the Google Doc. Make sure you turn it in on Google Classroom. Have a great day. See ya.